Good morning and welcome to Kirklees Local TV's weekly wind-up. I am Bishop Napier, your host for today. Each week we aim to review the latest news and to explore the impact such news will have on our local community. Our weekly wind-up program is not just interesting and amusing, but challenging and very provocative. But as we talk to you today, please talk back to us and get involved in these lively discussions. You can do so by emailing us on info@kirkleeslocaltv.com or on Twitter @KirkleesLocalTV. My guest on today's show is Reverend Stephen Day, a minister at the Methodist Mission on Lord Street. And we also have Kevin Drayton, an architect and who works for a company, 117, and ironically, that company designed the mission. And we also have one of KLTV regular presenter, Kyle Warwick. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
The first subject we want to embrace today, as it's been in the news, green spaces versus brown spaces. Why are we not having more houses being built? And just before I ask for your comment, listen to this carefully. We need to build on the green belt to solve the housing crisis. The community building hubs, which did a recent survey, says we must sacrifice space to meet housing needs. They said 89% of the English land is underdeveloped and the countryside is not covered with concrete. On top of that, 1.8 million people sitting on the housing waiting list. The conclusion there says, homelessness rising, and the local councils are forced to place 4,000 families in unsuitable bed and breakfast. Are we in a crisis, gentlemen? Reverend Day, what's your thought on the green spaces versus houses?
I think for me, green spaces are tremendously important within any area because I think green spaces give opportunities for recreation which are vital, I think, to any community, places for people to play, to relax, to unwind. And so I would sort of be very cautious about sort of invading greenbelt spaces for more housing. I would sort of favour looking at communities that may have become neglected and underdeveloped and looking at the possibility of regeneration within communities where maybe housing stock has been neglected for a long period. Within this town there are buildings that have sat sort of derelict for many years, and so, you know, are there opportunities to maybe bring in some of those buildings that have been sat unused and bring those into potential opportunities for creating new housing?
So would we say, Minister Day, with the influx of all the immigrants coming in from all around the world, and especially now that Europe is open, are we still going to have this housing crisis year after year, that we're infringing on green spaces?
I mean, I guess there's a lot to do with this. Well, there's a lot behind that sort of issue of immigration, and I guess at the moment the sort of mission is part of a project which is accommodating people who are homeless in Kirklees, and that's happening today. And a number of people that we're seeing are actually from sort of the Central and Eastern Europe. So I think the sort of thought that sort of people are sort of coming to England and finding it easy to get housing, employment and so on, I think it would be a sort of caricature of reality. But equally I think it's interesting when you hear media presentations about migration and particularly economic migrancy. It focuses on people coming into the country, but very rarely does it talk about people from this country who migrate to other parts. And also when people come into this country, they're considered to be economic migrants. But would people in our families, our communities who have maybe gone to Australia to work or so on, would we consider them to be economic migrants in the same way? But it's the same phenomenon.
Yes, it It is.
So I think we need to be careful when we sort of talk about migration, what we're actually talking about, and remembering migration works in two directions.
Lovely. Well, today we are fortunate to have an architect on board. And normally they find the opportunity to design these lovely buildings, so they might be looking for space. Kevin, what's your thought on the dilemma in using up some of our green spaces for more houses to meet the homelessness?
Well, I would agree that we need more homes. I don't think there's much doubt about that.
That's right.
I mean, the crude figures that are often bandied about is that we need something in the order of 250,000 new homes each year. But that's a very simple headline, and I think we need to look behind it to help understand what's going on. If we're talking about new homes and pressure on green space, that's a very emotive issue. And it's helpful if we can look a little bit underneath that. 2 or 3 things I would say. First of all, I looked up some simple statistics before we came on. And we have at the moment something like somewhere between 700 and probably 750,000 vacant homes at the moment in this country. And one of the problems that we have is that there is a great desire for the new at the moment. People don't like the idea of something second-hand, whether it's a house, a car, a TV, or whatever, which is a great shame, because I think that we can get a lot more longevity out of many buildings than we give them credit for. Alex Gordon, who was an old president of the Royal Institute of British Architects, coined a phrase back in the 80s, I think it was, which was long life, loose fit, low energy. And to be honest, in 35, 40 years of practice, I've not really bettered that as a motto by which to design.
Yeah.
So if you're going to build something, make it long life. And you've only got to look around Kirklees and see we've got buildings that have been up for hundreds of years. The second part of the axiom, loose fit, means that as long as you don't design them too tightly for a single function, they can adapt, they can change.
Yes.
One of the things that annoys me about the whole sustainability debate, and I hate the word sustainability, is that you can only design for sustainability if you know what the requirements are going to be in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. And we don't. Because if we did, we wouldn't be sitting here now. We'd all have made our fortunes and be retired to an island somewhere. So you don't know what's going to happen. What you do is you design buildings to be flexible and be adaptable for all those things we don't know. Anyway, I won't take too much more time. But when it comes, therefore, down to green space, of course we need green space. You cannot function without green space. But that's not the same as saying green belt.
Yeah.
Green belt is a very specific type of planning designation. And there are opportunities, particularly at the fringes, within settlements that perhaps are completely covered by green belt. There may be opportunities for housing developments. But you still need green space. Huddersfield, for example, wouldn't be the same without Beaumont Park, without the park across the road from us here. You need those green spaces within developments. It's a balance. And then the final thing I would say is when it comes to pressure for housing on green belt, it's a difference if you're going to put up 100 houses, most of which are all the same, from a large developer, as opposed to small pockets of 3, 4, 5 houses where there's a little opportunity, a windfall space. Those are the things that we should be looking at first and foremost.
Well, certainly, Kevin, you sound like the Minister of Housing. And if you were going for the political position, certainly you have my vote. Well, we've got Kyle here, who represents a younger version, and when we're thinking of owning our own homes in these last days, Kyle, how do you see the impact of the green spaces versus more homes that we can call and get a mortgage for?
Well, I agree that, with yourself on the flexibility issue. I think we have a lot of buildings that are old buildings that have been proven to be flexible beyond their former usage. Mills, especially in the Colne Valley. The Titanic Mill Spar is a building that has been completely converted from a derelict empty building into something that is a housing space, it's a hotel, and it's a spa area which brings people into the local area from a wider region. I think I wouldn't like to see too much building on even green space, because I think we see recently with what's happened with the flooding in the south of England, where overdeveloped areas, the water feeds off into the river systems far quicker, the rivers can't cope with them, they flood. That causes a massive amount of strain to local and central government. And I think we've got to sort of balance his desire for new houses with a sort of sensible means of using the space that we have to us already. I think there's plenty of buildings in the town centre and in regions further out in the Kirklees area that are rife for being reinvigorated, really. Plenty of mills.
I think that's interesting. If I could come back on that, I think one of the other great difficulties we have is that we have national planning policy. We have the national planning policy framework. Mm-hmm. And then, in theory, underneath that, we have local development plans. And really, the national planning policy can only, by definition, be very headline decisions. And we do have to take decisions at a local level, depending on our particular circumstances. Some areas of the country are more prone to flooding than others. Of course, we have flood zones within Kirklees, and we need to acknowledge those. But we also, in West Yorkshire in particular, in Kirklees, we have a lot of hills that they don't necessarily have in other parts of the country.
Yes.
And that imposes particular considerations when it comes to development and so on. So balancing up national priorities and local priorities, I think, is something else that we should bear in mind.
Well, the discussion's really going very well in the studio here today, but we have to go to a short break, and we are asking you not to switch over. We'll be right back immediately after this short break. Welcome back to Kirklees Local TV's weekly wind-up, where the discussions here are going very good. Now, aligning to green spaces, we seem to be coming up to the next big issue. One is housing. Now we have Britain, according to public opinion, is now turning to the food banks. Hear what the Trusted Trust says. The stats for the financial year 2012-2013, biggest ever increase in UK food banks use. 170% rise in the numbers turning to food banks. The Mail newspaper says it this way: it's very hard to know why people go to food banks, claimed Tory Welfare Minister Lord Freud. Food poverty? Is it because there's a punitive welfare system? Or does food poverty really shame this government? Kyle, where are we going with this food bank?
Well, I'm sure it is quite difficult for a ward to understand what is going on with the poorest and most vulnerable people in the nation. I think it's quite easy for somebody like that to make a statement like that. But I can totally understand why people are turning to food banks. It goes hand in hand with one of the most severe periods of austerity the country's ever seen. So it's unsurprising at 170% rise in the numbers. I think there's obviously going to be a certain degree of austerity. I think that has to be, the problem's been massive overspending and then swinging that around to massive underspending, and people have found that really quite a difficult situation to adjust to. So I really can't see a situation in the future where food banks are going to become unnecessary. It seems to me that the gap is widening between the poorest and the the richest, and the richest don't really understand the situation of the poorest. So I can only envisage a situation where food banks will continue to be necessary, really.
Well, if we were to follow the theme, it seems as if some people are blaming a very punitive welfare system, and some people even said, well, does the government really feel ashamed why they do not want to address the matter? Kevin, can you shed some light as to where this country is going with the food bank?
In a word, no, I can't. What I would say is that I would leave it to other people to try and understand why we've come to a situation such as we have. But in my experience, we do attempt to plan. Whether or not we get it right is another matter. This is why I have a problem with this whole sustainability argument. You can plan for sustainability if you know what's going to happen.
That's correct.
But the fact is that life has a habit of throwing a spanner in the works, and you can plan for a future that simply doesn't come about. Life events, whether it be redundancy, whether it be marriage breakup, death in the family, all sorts of events, things that you just can't anticipate. You get up in the morning, you do not know that in 3 hours' time, as you're driving to an appointment, you're going to have an accident, and the enormous ramifications of that. And the fact of the matter is that, as we are at the moment in this country, we need food banks. What I'm more concerned about is if we find that we are in a crisis and then don't do something about it, then I think we can legitimately take politicians to task. The fact is, at the moment, there is a need for food banks. There are, shall we say, crises for people. And what we've got to look to the government to do, as well as all the other agencies, and let's face it, there are, thankfully, hundreds of charities, individuals and organisations helping to look at this. It's if we're not improving the situation and making it better, then we have a legitimate gripe with the politicians.
That's great. Well, I know the church has been a bedrock when it comes to welfare and social problems. And so it is not new to you, Reverend Day, but what have you seen in your own practice as you go along on a daily, weekly basis? Can you attest to this increase in people coming to the mission or the church for help?
Yeah, very much so. And the Welcome Centre, which is the food bank in Huddersfield, is within the mission building, albeit a separate entity. And they have seen in the last year the number of people requesting, needing packs, whether that be food, household utensils, and so on, literally doubling in the last year. And it's how you meet that need. And yeah, we see every day lots of people with a wide variety of needs and situations, reflecting, you know, what we thought about with the very different circumstances by which people come to need to use food banks. And I think in relation to shaming poverty, I think benefit sanctions is an enormous issue. You know, we see people that are being sanctioned for seeming extremely trivial reasons, people that are then left with no recourse to anything. But of course, there is the safety net, because things like the Welcome Centre and other food banks in Kirklees end up having to pick up the pieces of people who find themselves with no access to any other money resources at all for a particular period. And I just find that appalling that in this country people should be put in that sort of position where you're literally denied any access to anything, and you're relying on the fact that there is this safety net of food banks to try and bail out people who are put in that situation. And so, you know, I long for the day, in a sense, when there is no need for food banks. And I would hope that it's great to see that the generosity that there exists, I mean, not just within Kirklees, but across the country, the real generosity of people, even when people are finding themselves struggling, who are willing to donate food, clothing, household utensils to places like the Welcome Centre. And I think that's testament to, you know, the interconnectedness that there has to be. But I think one of the things I would love to see is that when people make a gift to a food bank, wherever that may be, to just pause to think, why are people in a position where they need to be accessing food banks? Because people have said that, if you create a food bank, the demand will be there.
Yes.
But I wonder how many people in this country would choose to go to a food bank for their food.
Well, I think my fellow presenter Kyle is itching to get in, so we're going to give him the opportunity.
Well, I mean, on that sort of the subject of should the government be shamed, I think there should be a certain level of shame across the entirety of society that we're in a position where people need to use food banks.
Yes.
But I think for myself, I'm lucky enough not to be in that position. But if I was on sort of state benefits and things and having to pay taxes on my benefits and then seeing big businesses like your Apples avoiding paying tax in this country and not being forced to pay tax in this country, I'd find that to be a situation that I'd leave an extremely bitter taste in my mouth, let's put it that way.
Lovely. Kevin, you wanted to say something here?
Really, at a much simpler level, just that it was interesting the quotation came from the Daily Mail, not necessarily my everyday reading, but I think that one of the things that becomes exemplified in the sort of comment that the Mail has made there is that it's one thing to talk about abstract groups of people, and it's quite another to talk about individuals, particularly individuals that you know. So in other words, it's quite possible, I've found in my experience, to talk about a group with a label and to characterise them in one particular way.
Yeah.
Every single one of the individuals that makes up that group will be different, have their own story. And once you actually understand that and get to know them, I think one's attitude changes.
Yes. Well, the discussions are really going so good, and we want to hear from you. Please talk back to us and get involved in this lively discussion. You can do so by email at info@kirkleeslocaltv.com or on Twitter at KirkleesLocalTV. We are going straight on to our third issue this week, gentlemen. And the newspapers all over the region has made it clear. It seems as if our accident and emergency service will be greatly considered an axe in a few months' time, I suppose. One of them, we're told, must go. Now, we have lost so many of our services already from HRI. Where do you think we're going, and who is going to be suffering the most? And can we have somebody, some of our politicians, to tell us the truth? What will happen to the accident and emergency service at HRI? Reverend, have you heard anything that we haven't heard so far?
Sadly, no. Sorry. But yes, I mean, I share a lot of the sort of concerns that sort of people are expressing in terms of the time it would take to get to A&E. I mean, not just by ambulance, but, you know, if somebody was needing to be taken to A&E, how you get there, because a couple of weeks ago, it seemed like A&E would be kept at the infirmary here, and at Calderdale it would be shut. Yeah. I have sort of, you know, my sister and brother-in-law are in Illingworth at the sort of far end of Halifax, and I'm just thinking about if they needed to bring, you know, if they needed to come to A&E in Huddersfield, how long would it take them to get here? And I think that sense of the distance people would be travelling, and the same would be true if people are on the south side of Huddersfield, you know, needing to get to Calderdale. That, you know, the same issue applies, that the length of time and the danger that it potentially puts on people's lives.
Well, I know in the village that I live in Marsden, if Huddersfield, the A&E at Huddersfield was closed, it'd be quicker for me to get to Oldham accident and emergency than it would be to get to Halifax accident emergency. So it's like asking people to choose which leg they want chopping off.
That's right.
Both of them, you're going to suffer, and people are going to suffer whichever one gets closed. It doesn't matter. The accident and emergencies, especially on a weekend, will be extremely busy. People will be dealt with slower. The amount of time that it takes a heart attack victim to go from a stable state to a severe condition, I imagine, is quite rapid. So that period of time added onto that journey that they have to spend in an ambulance, which is not the most comfortable place to be in. I mean, it seems to me another step too far, really.
Well, Kevin, it seems as if we're living in the era, like Kyle says, where there's just cuts and cuts and cuts, and where does it end? Now, people in rural societies, of course, have not been factored into this. What can you share regarding this dilemma that we are currently facing?
I suppose I look at it very much from personal experience point of view. And I'm sadly old enough now to have lived through enormous changes in our society. When I was a child growing up in a very rural village, in fact in East Anglia, we were something like 25 miles from the nearest hospital, and I'm not even confident that had an accident and emergency service at that time. The medical services that we had were a once-a-week surgery held by a GP in the back room of our local co-op, and that seemed pretty good. As the years have gone by, services have improved, and we've come to a situation now where, when I was playing rugby, not that many years ago, and I would get my head kicked in on a Saturday afternoon, I would assume I had a perfect right just to go stroll down the road wherever I was, York, Harrogate, Huddersfield, sit in accident and emergency and get it sorted out in a few minutes. But that's been very hard won, and it costs a lot of money. And if we can't continue to afford it, then we can't continue to afford it. But it shouldn't be that simple. There are other ways of looking at the problem. And if what we need to do is to have a service that gets medical treatment in emergency situations to people, that can perhaps be handled in other ways. I'm not advocating the cutting or shutting of an A&E department. What I'm saying is, if it genuinely has to happen, let's look at making provision in other ways. If your rural transport system is, in the case of my mother who still lives in East Anglia, 2 buses a week to the local town, that's 2 a week, not 2 a day, then in fact the situation in which we find ourselves in much of Kirklees doesn't seem that bad. It's very much a case of what you get used to.
Yes.
I think as well, though, you can look at the way the central government appropriates money across the board and look at how that money can be better appropriated to help people that are suffering within this country. I think A&E is a vital service in various different places, and there are other areas of the budget that, personally anyway, I would look at and look at how can we shave money there so that we don't have to lose our A&E services. I'd also like to know if the A&E is closed at Huddersfield or Halifax, are some of those members of staff going to be moved on to the hospital that is left open to take up some of the extra strain that will be put on that hospital? Because I think there must be a lot of people wondering what is going to happen to their jobs at the A&Es now.
That's right.
And whether they will be looking for new jobs.
I think certainly right across the board, staff, patients, and all of us within the community are very concerned, one way or the other. I told you before, discussions very lively, informative, and provocative. Well, all good things must come to an end, and unfortunately, our time is gone. But please, it doesn't end for you. Please contact us and let us hear your views. Send them to info@kirkleeslocal.com or on Twitter @KirkleesLocalTV. My thanks today to our guests, Reverend Day, Kevin, and our own resident presenter, Kyle Warren. Thank you very much, and thank you for watching Kirklees Local TV. We'll be back next week with another edition.